right. We are here, and I see Dr. Shipley has started the recording. So in effort to respect your time, let's get started and take care of everything that we need to so Dr. Mollway can have the floor right at the top of the actually 35 after the hour. So we are so excited to have another session in front of us today. And our closing keynote today is Mary Mollway. And I hope we have the time just to kind of clear our brains in this keynote and explore more about the sensory system in learning. Dr. Mollway spent nearly 30 years in K-12 education as a classroom teacher, a curriculum coordinator, and a site administrator. She continues to work as a reading specialist in her private practice, combining the science of reading with movement patterns and brain training programs. Dr. Mollway earned her EDD in Administrative Leadership in Teaching and Learning and was awarded a Leadership Award for her excellence in educational leadership out of over 6,000 graduates in 2018. Wow, that is a great honor. She was recognized by the County of Riverside, California, as Woman of the Year for her work in the autism community. In 2016, Dr. Mollway delivered a TED Talk entitled Brain Moves, focusing on the relationship between movement and brain development. And we know that is still available online, so go check that out. Next slide, please. Before we jump into Dr. Mollway's presentation, we kindly request your attention for a brief moment.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. In the spirit of transparency and respect for our community, we have some information we'd like you to read in the on-screen disclaimer. By taking a few moments to read through the disclaimer, you empower yourself with the pertinent information regarding the boundaries of our knowledge sharing environment. I'm going to pause and let you read the disclaimer. Next slide, please. Take a moment to read through this slide also. Then together, we'll embark on this exciting session while we push boundaries and leave an indelible mark on the ever-evolving landscape of early childhood education knowledge. Dr. Mollway, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. As she said, my name's Dr. Mary Mollway, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today. My work right now focuses in my private practice called BrainWorks, and I really merge all the loves of my life, which is how movement improves brain function and actually develops our brain to begin with, as well as my long educational career focusing on reading. So I've kind of merged all of those things in together in one. My last educational placement was as the assistant head of school at Park Academy, which is a specialized school for dyslexia outside of Portland, Oregon, and I built the instructional and reading program there. I am an adjunct professor and associate faculty at UAGC and a couple other universities, focusing on teacher education. And the disciplines that I trained in for the movement-based are MNRI, which is Mosquitova Neurosensory Motor Reflex Integration. That is a mouthful. That is Svetlana Mosquitova's work. And I'm also an instructor for Brain Gym and RMT. So that's rhythmic movement training. So now that we've got all of that out of the way, let's see what we're going to learn about today. So my goal for all of us today is that you will be able to understand the relationship between the sensory system and academic learning, that you will generally understand the various sensory systems and how they develop. You'll be able to identify the signs of an immature sensory system and understand how to address these deficits for better student outcomes. Now, I've been studying this for about 17 years, and so I'm not going to be able to cover all of everything in an hour, but really the point of today is to give you a general idea, maybe to give you a different view of how children learn in the early years and why movement and specific movement is so important to their brain development. So in early childhood, these are just some of the skills that we're hoping that children can demonstrate for us through age 5, that they can play with each other, nicely. They can keep their body to themselves. They can regulate their own emotions. They can run without tripping. They can kick, throw, and catch a ball, and they can follow 2 to 3 step directions. Now, obviously, there's a much longer list, but these are some of the ones that kind of stood out to me. Things that I hear from the parents when they bring their kiddos to me looking for help in these age ranges. It oftentimes has to do with physical coordination and being able to regulate their bodies and their emotions. So how is it that an infant gets from the point of basically being helpless and not being able to process really anything around them except the sound and smell of mom to being able to run, kick a ball, play with others? Like, how does that happen in just 3 years' time? I find that very fascinating. And I started studying this because I was a reading specialist at the high school level. And I just needed to know, like, how is it that a child could be 14 or 15 years old and still be a non-reader, even though they had been in schools in this country their entire lives? How does that happen? So I started studying brain development to see if I could figure out what is it that didn't happen for these students that should have happened, and is there something I can do about it as a classroom teacher? And the answer is yes. So that's the exciting part. This is an amazing pyramid. We're going to spend a few minutes on this, and I'd like to give a shout out to the folks at Hemispheres Therapeutics in the UK for developing this. I want you to look at the top of that pyramid and notice that says academics. Now, as an educational institution, that is where we focus 90% of our energy, is helping kids learn academic skills. Reading, writing, math, right? But look at all the things that are under that have to come first. Look at all the things that come under that have to come first. What we're going to spend our time today is down here on the bottom 3 layers of this pyramid: the central nervous system, intent sensory processing, and then sensory processing. Whoops, I did not mean to do that. So let's start down here in the central nervous system. So in the first 3 years of life, but really very concentrated in the first 12 months of life, all babies go through developmental movement patterns. We know that because when you take your baby to the pediatrician or you read what to expect in the first year, there's a chart of what babies are supposed to do and when at 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. And if babies don't meet those developmental milestones, we say they're developmentally delayed if it's outside a certain window. Those movement patterns are called reflex patterns. And those reflex patterns are actually what connect the central nervous system. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Once the central nervous system is connected, then we have intense sensory processing. That's the red layer on your pyramid there. You'll notice proprioception is in the middle of that. Proprioception is the first of our senses to develop in utero, and it is the basis for all other senses. That is why it is in the middle at the bottom of that pyramid. What is proprioception? That's our brain's ability to know where we are in space. But we have 7 different types of proprioceptors. So we have proprioceptors that tell us about pressure and pain and temperature. We have them in our ligaments and our joints that tell our muscles how much to contract. So for example, if I'm working with a young man, he's in his 30s who had a massive stroke and he's completely spastic on the right side, but we are retraining that side of his brain and his body to come back online. But the proprioceptors in his ligaments and muscles have gone haywire and are not giving his brain the right information. So his muscles stay constricted all the time. That's what's causing that. It's a problem in the proprioceptive system. So proprioception tells us where we are in space at all times, how much pressure we have. It's one of the reasons we like touch so much, because when you give somebody a nice hug, you're activating their proprioceptors. If you've ever stood on a wobble board, or a vibration plate. Those activate our proprioceptors. It's very calming to the brain. Vestibular and tactile, which are on the outside of those, are subsets of proprioception. Vestibular is our balance system, and tactile is our skin. So our balance system is directly connected to our auditory and visual systems. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And our tactile system is an integral part of our proprioceptive system. We take in a tremendous amount of information from our tactile system. And in fact, even the follicles in your hair have little receptors. There's proprioceptors in there that are always reading the environment like antenna. Isn't that fascinating? Then one layer from that, we have sensory processing: vision, smell, taste, and auditory. The ones I'm going to focus on are vision and auditory, because those are the ones that are so involved in learning. Now, remember, I said that vestibular was connected to vision and auditory. So there's actually a reflex called the vestibular ocular reflex, ocular meaning eyes, so that when you turn your head, your eyes don't flip out of control, or when you bring your head up, or if you spin in a circle, you can still keep a focal point. So it allows your balance system and your vision system to work independently, but also connected. And then your auditory and balance system, your vestibular system, are so connected that those two nerves actually join and become the 8th cranial nerve. So even though our sensory systems work independently, they are also deeply involved with each other. And if there's problems in the lower sensory systems in this red area, there's going to be issues with the higher sensory systems in that orange area. Why is that important? The number one reason why children are referred to special education is for reading disabilities or being behind in reading. What are the two senses that are necessary according to the science of reading for kids to read? Auditory and visual. Right? It's the combination of auditory and visual processing, which allows us to become proficient readers with an overlay of working memory and executive functioning. So if we have deficits in proprioception, vestibular, and tactile, we will have deficits in auditory and visual. So when somebody comes to me from a reading assessment, I will do a traditional reading assessment, but also I'm looking at their neurodevelopment. Are all the things in place that need to be there for a child to be able to read and write and do mathematics? And if we have deficits in these bottom 3 layers of this pyramid, those things are not in place. And then as we move up through the pyramid, we'll do that a little more quickly. We have developing symmetry, which is, are we doing things equally? Awareness of left and right. Awareness of front and back, and not on this body awareness, is also top and bottom. Those are the 3 planes that our bodies operate in. And then we go to attention and focus, crossing of the midline, emotional settlement, which is like emotional security. And then we move up to integrated motor movement. And then we move up to perceptual motor movement. So every time we move up this rung, it is dependent on all the rungs or levels underneath that being fully developed. And look what's in purple there: language processing and learning, organization, sequencing, and planning. Remember that oral language comes before written language, and oral language is foundational for students to be able to be proficient readers, because we use what we know about oral language to apply that to print. Oral language will not fully develop unless all of those other rungs underneath it are fully developed and integrated. Okay. So the sensory system of an infant, they're born with very little ability to process sensory input at all. The biggest way that they interpret the world is putting things into their mouth through their neurotactile system. So sucking and their skin via touch on that proprioceptive tactile system. This is how they interpret the entire world. And this is just an interesting note that the tongue has a direct connection to our brain stem, which is where all brain development begins. The brain develops from the bottom up and the body develops from the top down. So when babies are sucking, they're actually activating their brainstem, which is where sensory processing begins. It's where our reticular activation system is, which regulates states of alertness in the brain, and is actually where language begins to be processed in the outer sides of the cerebellum. It is not actually up here in the Broca Center. Language is processed there, but it begins in the brainstem. So babies who have problems latching, who have poor sucking, that's a reflex. It's one of those primary primitive reflexes, and it really has an impact on their development. Then after birth, once babies get out of this very early stage after birth, the sensory system begins to pattern out through something called archetype movements, which are like the biomechanics of reflex patterns, and then these primary and postural reflex patterns, which is what we're going to talk mostly about today. So the development of the nerve net. When babies are born, they have all the neurons or brain cells in the brain that they need at birth, but they're not connected. They're not in nets. And I'm going to show you a picture of that in just a moment. By 3 months, the connections or the synapses between those neurons has multiplied by 20 times in the first 3 months of life. Isn't that amazing? And how does that happen? Through movement patterns. Movement, those primary reflex patterns and archetype movements, and sensory experiences develop the nerve net. And when the nerve net is fully developed and myelinated, meaning that it's coated, they're matured with those essential fatty acids, then sensory information is processed correctly. So the connections have to be made, and then they have to be matured through sensory input and movement patterns. Now, we've all heard stories of babies who were raised in some unfortunate foreign orphanages. The Romanian orphanage are the most notorious, where they did not receive any stimulation and they were left alone in their cribs for hours. And those children have significant cognitive impairment because of that, because they didn't get that sensory stimulation and weren't given the opportunity to go through those movement patterns because they were confined in a crib. So here's a picture of the nerve net development. These little guys are dendrites, the spots with the red dots in the middle, those are dendrites. And so you can see at birth, there's very few connections. But once you get to 3 months, look how many more there are. And by 24 months, our brains are exploding with connections. And we have to have this nerve net, these synapses, for messages to travel across different areas of the brain and across the corpus callosum, which is the center part of our brain, the white matter down the center of our brain. We're going to move into really talking about these reflex patterns now. So what are primary and postural reflex patterns? Let me say also that depending on whose work you read, they're also called primitive reflex patterns. So Dr. Moskotova, who I've studied under extensively, refers to them as primary, meaning first. But Dr. Goddard in the United Kingdom, who's kind of the grandmother of this work there, refers to them as primitive. So you'll see both terms, but they're referring to the same thing. There's a slight technical difference, but it doesn't matter for this presentation. So these primary and postural reflex patterns actually start beginning to develop in utero during pregnancy. Like the first one starts developing at 11 weeks gestation. That is amazing. And that's trunk extension. So they are specific movement patterns that emerge and integrate at specific times. And each movement pattern is genetically encoded. Our DNA knows exactly what's supposed to happen at certain time periods, which is why we have those developmental charts. And I'll give you an example of this. I'm working with this young boy, a significant global delay in all areas. 5.5 really presented like he was about 18 months old. And as we started working with these reflex patterns, all of a sudden he started doing other things above that. Well, how is that possible if I didn't work on that specifically? They're genetically encoded. So once the brain got the right stimulus, the right information, it was like, oh, hold on. I know what I'm supposed to do here. I know how to crawl on all fours, even though he skipped that pattern when he was that age. And all of a sudden he started crawling. And in 3 months of working together, we've seen this tremendous explosion of speech and motor coordination and trying new foods. And because we stimulated the genetic code. These movement patterns stimulate changes in the brain and create new pathways to myelination, and then develops and matures the entire sensory system. Without reflex patterns, there is no sensory development. So if a child is significantly behind in these reflex patterns, they have to be addressed directly for students, children to be able to catch up in their development. We'll talk about a few of those reflex patterns today, specifically. So the ATNR, and I have a slide on each of these afterwards. The ATNR is the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. It emerges 3 months in utero, and it integrates 6 to 7 months after birth. What does that mean for it to integrate? It means that it's not present anymore. It's not running the show. So for a few months after birth, babies will lay in that fencer pose, which I just think is adorable. It's my favorite pose. But they don't lay like that forever. They only lay like that for a specific time period, because that movement pattern has a specific role in development. And once the baby has moved through that pattern and it's matured, then the next pattern comes forward. So it's a little bit like leapfrog. One emerges, matures, another emerges, matures, another emerges, matures. And they go on like that through the first 3 years of life. Spinal galant is the next one. It emerges 3 to 4 months in utero, and it integrates 5 to 9 months after birth. This is the reflex that allows babies to roll over. The one side of the spine will contract, and it allows them to rotate their body on the floor. So without spinal galant, we get babies who cannot roll one side or the other. STNR is symmetrical tonic neck reflex. That's the crawling reflex on all fours. In Europe, they call it creeping. We call it crawling here, though. That emerges 4 months in utero, and it integrates 10 months after birth. This is a postural reflex, meaning that it changes our posture. It gets us up off the floor, onto our hands and knees, and assists with getting a child upright so that they can walk. And then the final one on this slide is trunk extension. This emerges 1 month after birth. And if you hold up a baby under their arms, their legs will straighten and their toes will point downwards. That is trunk extension. And that helps make a connection between their brainstem and their midbrain and their neocortex, where learning and language occur. And this integrates 7 to 9 months after birth. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about some of these reflexes more in depth. So let's look at ATNR first. As I said, this stands for asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. It establishes bilaterality, meaning 2 sides. When a baby is in this position, they are using their right ear and they're using their left hand. When they turn to this side, they're using their left ear and their right hand. Why does that matter? It matters auditorily because our ears actually process different information. So everything in the brain and the body is contralateral, everything. So if you see in your right eye, it's processed on the left side of your brain. If you move your left hand, it's processed right here in the sensory motor cortex on the right side. If I hear in my left ear, it's processed in the right temporal lobe. Everything is contralateral. So when we establish bilaterality, we know that both sides of our brain are active and that we can use both sides, eyes, ears, hands, feet, legs, equally or independently as we choose. Now, the ATNR actually helps the baby get out of the birth canal. And then after birth, it's one of the reflexes that helps them get ready to roll. As they turn their head and they put their arm out, they're learning like, oh, I have a side over here. Oh, I have a side over here. And I just realized I forgot to finish what I was saying about what we hear in each ear. I apologize for that. So in our left ear, that is right brain. And so we process primarily rhythm and tone. In our right ear, that's left brain, we process primarily language and beat because it's connected to the Broca center on the left side. And our brain has to merge those pieces of information. In kids with reading disabilities, 99% of the time of the kids that I see, you will see the ATNR active on the left side. So they are not processing language effectively, hence poor phonemic awareness, hence poor reading. The ATNR also myelinates our auditory pathways. So earlier reflexes connect them, and then the ATNR helps mature those pathways as babies are laying here and they're processing sound here, and they're laying this way and they're processing sound here. It is helping to mature those pathways for more efficient auditory processing, which is a whole nother lecture in and of itself. The ATNR also separates head and arm movement. Up until this position, the brain doesn't actually know that the head and the arm are separate. And then all of a sudden it's like, hey, look at that. I can move my head and my arm. Oh, that's amazing. Wait, I've got another side. So for the first time, we have rotation of the neck and head separate from the trunk. This is a big deal. It starts not only auditory processing, but the ability to track visually and to be able to use our hand and our eyes together for hand-eye coordination to grasp at things. This is also a really, really important reflex in nursing. ATNR helps babies cross the midline of our body. Remember, I talked about that corpus callosum and how everything is contralateral. So this is one of the reflexes that helps develop that corpus callosum so information can travel freely across the midline. And as I mentioned, it also helps develop visual tracking. The symmetrical tonic neck reflex, or STNR, is what you would recognize as the crawling reflex, as this picture shows. This reflex is so important for reading and academics, so important. So many things happen in this brief stage. Babies only crawl for about 3 months, but there are 3 stages to the STNR. So when babies sit on their legs and rock themselves in their crib, that's STNR. When they lay with their tushy up in the air and their head down, that's STNR 2, and then this is STNR 3. And every one of those pieces of it does something a little bit different. But this is the first time in the baby's development, they're like, hey, look, I have legs and arms, and I can segment my body at my hips. That's amazing. It helps develop near point vision and visual accommodation. So when we're reading, we're not out here at far point, we're right here at near point. And so when a baby is crawling on the ground and they see a toy and they bring it up to them, this is near point, right? And they're using their hands to get it. They're using intentional movement. And then visual accommodation is being able to look far and near. Think of this in school, looking at a board, looking at something, copying it down. That's visual accommodation. And think of a baby crawling around on the floor. They're looking up for something, grabbing it, bringing in. So we're starting to develop that visual accommodation. It develops muscle tone, and the development of a core is vital for all physical development. And I will say that 99% of the kids that I see in my office do not have an active core because some of those reflexes were not activated or matured. It develops contralateral movement. because babies are crawling contralaterally, and it develops the corpus callosum. I was very sad to see the American Pediatrics Association post a statement a few months ago that it doesn't matter if babies crawl, they can skip that stage, it's fine. It is 1000% not fine. So much happens neurologically during this stage. You can go back and replicate it, but usually by the time it's caught, children are really far behind in their academic skills and their speech. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the Moro reflex. This is the first reflex you'll see after birth. When a baby comes through the birth canal or they're taken from mom in a C-section, they will stretch their body back like this picture. They tilt their head back and they take their first breath. It is the Moro reflex, which enables the first breath of life. If babies had a hard time taking that first breath, it means the Moro did not activate. There was probably something that happened in utero, and it is indicative that there will most likely be problems later on if it is not addressed right away. The Moro reflex stays with us for life, but it changes a little bit, which I'll talk about in just a moment. In the infant, it's also called the startle reflex. This is the baby's survival mechanism. So if it's scared, if it's cold, if it's hungry, if it's wet, if it's needs mom or a dad, or they hear something loud or see something kind of scary because they don't see very well when they're first born, they'll startle. And the other side of that is the fetal position. So Moro has 2 stages, 1 and 2. 1 is out here, 2 is the fetal position. It should integrate by 4 months. And if it remains retained, it can lead to poor impulse control, focus, attention, emotional regulation, cognitive regulation, crossing the midline, and working memory. That's a lot. How does it have such a big impact? Well, the Moro reflex becomes our fight or flight reflex. I'll say that again. The Moro reflex becomes our fight or flight reflex. It becomes part of our permanent toolbox of survival. This is the baby's mechanism for survival. It is what allows it to let its caregivers know that it needs something. And that is similar to how it is used in a child or adult. It's our sensor that something is wrong in the environment and our brain senses danger. When the Moro reflex stays active beyond the time that it should, that brain is stuck in fight or flight. So there's many physiological changes that happen with fight or flight. Our eyes diverge from midline to look for danger. What we hear changes. So we can't process language very well because our brain doesn't care about words when we're in a state of danger. And think about a time when you were really upset with someone and they were talking at you and you were like, oh, don't even talk to me right now, because you feel like you're going to crawl out of your skin if they keep talking. That's why. It's a physiological response to fight or flight. We have a hard time sitting still because our bodies want to run away from danger. Kids may need to use the bathroom all the time, particularly if they get nervous, like, oh, we're going to do a writing assignment and I hate writing. I need to all of a sudden go to the bathroom. Because in fight or flight, our brain tells our body to empty our bladder and our bowels to prepare to run away from danger. And it also diverts energy away from the prefrontal cortex and into the limbs, because we don't need to problem solve when we're in survival, right? So making sure that this Moro reflex is integrated in those first few months of life is incredibly important for someone over the lifespan. Many times people with a retained Moro get a diagnosis of ADHD because that's how they present. But if you were to do a brain scan, you would not see reduced activity really in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the hallmark of ADHD. Unless you read Daniel Amen's work, and he says that there's 6 different types, but generally it's dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But it is all the physiological responses to fight or flight, which are causing the ADHD-like symptoms. So thinking about this immature sensory development, when reflexes do not emerge on time or are retained, as I said, the sensory system will not develop fully. In the early stages of development, all of the senses operate together. Any stimulus activates the Moro reflex. So whether it's a visual stimulus or tactile, like it's cold or they've got a wet diaper, or it's a loud sound, every one of those simulates the same response. The sensory systems are on one pathway. Over time, these differentiate and mature so that we can only listen if we choose to. We can only watch if we choose to. We could use them together if we choose to. But in these early stages, there is no choice. They fully operate together. And when I ran the School for Dyslexia, when I was the assistant head there, this is something I saw quite frequently, is that children could not do phonemic awareness activities unless there was a visual component, because their sensory systems were directly connected. And so we had to figure out ways to be able to address that, to help mature those. A differentiated and mature sensory system is required for fluent and proficient reading. As I mentioned earlier, the proprioceptive system is the first one to develop. So these are the foundational sensory systems. They all began developing in utero. So the neurotactile proprioceptive system, those are the same system. Vestibular, and those provide the basis for the auditory and visual systems, as I mentioned on the first slide. Because I'm a reading specialist, and this is such a big focus in schools, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how the sensory system is involved in reading. So the two main systems involved in reading are auditory and visual. So auditory processing is an umbrella term, meaning all of the auditory skills involved. So auditory processing is the big umbrella, and there are many parts to that. Phonological awareness that I have listed here. The alphabetic principle depends on auditory processing. Under auditory processing, though, you'll also see auditory working memory, auditory discrimination, being able to differentiate between sounds. There's a whole list of those under that bigger umbrella. But for this presentation, we're going to focus on the phonological skills, which are directly tied to reading. So under phonological awareness, we have rhyming, phonemic awareness, which is being able to hear, segment, identify, and manipulate the sounds of the language. Like, what are the sounds in bat, b, at? That's phonemic awareness. Syllabication is being able to break words into syllables, like baseball. Alphabetic principle is being able to pair a letter with the sound that it represents. And then a lot of people don't know this, including teachers, is that the auditory system is actually what activates our visual word form area. Well, what the heck is that? So at the back of your brain is this little, I call it the file cabinet of the brain, where we store all the words that we know just by seeing them. You could call those sight words, but they're all the words that we have learned and we don't have to decode anymore. So when we look at a word, we'll use the word bat again, and we see the letters B-A-T. Immediately, within nanoseconds, our brain goes bat, bat. And then it sends a message back to the visual word form area. Do I have this word stored? Yeah, you do. That's bat. Oh, but which bat is it? That activates right brain. Is it the little animal that hangs upside down with wings? Is it the thing I swing at a ball? Is it swinging at something? Is it the verb? And that's where context comes involved. So the auditory system is involved in all of these aspects of reading. And an immature auditory system is a guarantee that a kid will struggle learning with pre-reading and reading skills. So we have two auditory pathways. The first is the non-classical pathway, which is strange to me because I would think classical would be first, but it's not. So the non-classical pathway develops first, and that's the one that comes straight up through the brainstem and goes right to the amygdala, or the emotion center of the brain. And remember, I said that at the beginning, our sensory systems all act together. So even visual stimuli will activate that non-classical auditory pathway. It is less specific, and it does not discriminate sounds as well. So when kids have problems with phonemic awareness, you're like, aha, we are operating on an older pathway. It may show up as poor auditory discrimination, which is for phonological and phonemic awareness. Then as it matures to the classical pathway, which takes a different route and goes up to the thalamus, which is where our auditory and visual information is processed in nanoseconds and then sent off to other areas of the brain for further processing. Let's talk a little bit about visual processing. I'm sure we all can recognize that our vision, being able to see the letters, has an impact on reading, but it is far greater than most of us realize. We'll talk about the processing side first on the left-hand side of the slide. So visual discrimination is, if I see two letters, can I tell that they're different? Can I tell that they're separated on the page? If kids write all of their words right next to each other without spaces, that's a visual discrimination issue. Visual figure ground is being able to determine what should be looked at. Like if I'm looking at a board and there's all kinds of things on the board, what deserves my attention? Visual perception. If kids are flipping letters horizontally or vertically, that is a visual perception problem. If they write up at an angle, that is a visual perception problem. Visual closure is the ability to finish something without seeing all of it. So for example, if you saw half a face, your brain could finish that off. It actually does that with words when you read. It's one of the things that allows us to read quickly. Visual working memory is being able to hold things long enough in our visual bank to be able to use them. So if I looked up at the board and I saw a sentence up there that I needed to copy down, I could hold that whole sentence in my visual working memory long enough to get it down. It's vital for reading comprehension because we have to be able to hold that long enough to get to the end of the sentence to then be able to make sense out of it. And then long-term visual memory, which is where that visual word form area would come into play. The other side of that is actually the motor skills of our vision system called ocular motor. So the left side is processing, that's down our nerves, right? That we're myelinated and connected through those movement patterns. And then ocular motor is eye tracking, visual pursuits and saccades, binocularity, can I use both eyes together? Visual accommodation, can I look up at the board and then back down at my paper? Up at the board, back down at my paper, and then fixation. This is a very little known visual skill, but fixation is being able to look at something long enough and be able to focus on it without your eyes jumping around. And I'll share an example of why this is so vitally important. I was working with a young man in my office who is diagnosed with dual deficit dyslexia, meaning both phonological and visual processing, profoundly dyslexic, lots of emotional regulation issues, and very poor balance and motor coordination. So we worked all the way through his reflex patterns. We did some brain training, his balance improved, self-regulation, speech improved. I was tutoring him in reading, and he's not making progress. And I'm just baffled by that. And then one day I realized that if I held a word up on a flashcard written in nice thick marker, that he could read it. But the minute it was in print, like a 12 font in front of him, he could no longer read it. And I thought, well, that's fascinating. And it occurred to me, it dawned on me that that was visual fixation. You notice how thick the print is here. So it's a bigger area for his eyes to hold on to fixate on. It doesn't take as much effort to fixate on that. When it's in small print, our eyes have to work much harder and have to be much more precise. So I sent him next door to my friend who's a developmental optometrist, and sure enough, he had a profound issue with visual fixation. So all these years of tutoring this poor soul had been doing and making no progress, he wasn't going to make progress. When I saw him, none of the connections were made, so we connected those. His pathways were not mature, and he had a significant visual fixation issue. And so reading is such a complex topic. There's like 100 reasons why a child might not be a proficient reader. I just wanted you to see that, oh, there might be this whole other kind of way of looking at this through a developmental lens that might really help a lot of kids out. The collective impact of having underdeveloped sensory systems is that it impacts higher systems. So as I mentioned in a couple of slides, that neurotactile, vestibular, and proprioceptive systems give important information to the brain. Improper information will consistently activate the Moro response. So if a child's core isn't active and they don't feel stable in their own body, or if auditory information isn't being processed correctly and all frequencies are coming in at the same volume, it's always going to trigger a Moro response. The brain will perceive that as danger. If the brain doesn't know where it is in space or can't regulate our balance, it will perceive that as danger and will activate a Moro response. And as I mentioned before, our vestibular, auditory, and visual systems are all interconnected. Weaknesses in sensory processing divert cognitive energy away from the neocortex. Do you remember how I mentioned that the brain develops from the bottom up? So reflex patterns really are brain stem and then create connections to the thalamus, basal ganglia, neocortex, and prefrontal cortex. That is its role, to connect all of those areas and then across left to right. If sensory processing is impacted, well, I'll back up. If there's issues with gross motor coordination and balance, gross motor coordination is brainstem. That's the bottom of the brain. Then if there's issues in sensory processing, auditory and visual, that's midbrain. But learning happens here. Attention, focus, self-regulation happens here. We won't get to the prefrontal cortex and the neocortex with nearly enough cognitive energy if we are having issues in the lower parts of the brain. And what you'll see on kids' psychological testing is that they'll have very high, like oral language skills, and their processing speed will be like 30, 40, 50 points lower. You're like, aha, this really isn't a cognitive processing issue then, is it? If a kid has phonological processing deficits, if they're struggling with reading, that's the #1 marker in school, right? Okay, there's a sensory processing issue that's impacting their cognitive processing, and then their focus, attention, self-regulation. Inhibition is a big one. Can I decide what to pay attention to and what not to? That's all prefrontal cortex. And working memory is prefrontal cortex. So can I hold things in working memory long enough to use them? This is necessary for all academics. If I look at a math problem, can I hold 3 + 2 = in my mind long enough to create a mental representation to solve it? If I hear the teacher give directions, can I hold that in my auditory working memory long enough to remember what she told me to do? These are all working memory and all prefrontal cortex executive functioning. These will not be fully online if there are issues in the brainstem or the midbrain. That's probably the biggest thing that I hope you take away from this talk today. As an educational professional, how would you recognize that kids have these troubles? Well, the body tells the story. I find myself watching people walk out in public and I'm like, oh, like I was getting off the train the other day on our way back from an Alaskan cruise, which was amazing, by the way. And this 20-something-year-old was toe walking in front of me. And I, in my mind, I'm like, oh, she struggled all the way through school, because I know what comes with that. So I'm going to give you some things to look for and then some things to do. And then we will have some time for some questions and answers. So looking at STNR, this is a big one. If a child is W sitting, that's a big indicator that STNR is active. Or if they cannot sit properly in a chair, you notice the picture of this young boy that he's tilted back. I've actually seen kids who could not sit on the floor during floor time. They would just throw themselves on their belly. Like, oh, the brain doesn't know that it can segment at the waist. Sometimes kids will sit on their feet in their chair. They'll sit backwards in the chair, or they'll want to stand at a standing desk. These all would be indicators that the STNR is still active. Balance and coordination. How do we recognize that they're having issues there? This one's probably the easiest one. They may trip or fall often. They might have a hard time staying seated. They really look uncoordinated when they run. They might stabilize themselves while they sit, like putting their feet under them or putting their feet around the bottom of the chair. They might have trouble on uneven surfaces. You see this when people get older, that they start to stumble a little bit and shuffle and have hard time unless the surface is even. That's because they're starting to lose their balance. Their vestibular system is starting to degrade as they get into their older years. How about emotional regulation? This is probably the one you are most familiar with in early childhood education that raises red flags. Can kids calm down once they get elevated? Are they having emotional outbursts? Is there excessive crying? Are there high levels of anxiety? Is there social withdrawal? These would all be indicators that there's something going on in their sensory system. Now, if you are not familiar with polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges's work, I would highly suggest that you do some reading in that area. He's done a ton of videos that are on YouTube if you prefer just to watch them. But it is a discussion of the vagus nerve and the two branches of the vagus nerve. Ventral vagal, which is where we want to be, rest and digest, learn, communicate, socially engage, and then dorsal vagal, which is fight or flight or fear paralysis. If kids are exhibiting these kinds of emotional regulation issues, they are in dorsal vagal, period. They're in dorsal vagal. That Moro response, fight or flight, dorsal vagal, and then fear paralysis. You'll see fear paralysis, that's the deer in the headlight. Oftentimes with kids who've been abused, are in foster care, people who've experienced a great deal of trauma go into fear paralysis. It is the most significant protective mechanism our brains have. Other ways to recognize challenges: sensitivity to textures or clothing, very poor personal space, poor balance, avoiding certain types of play, stabilizing themselves with reading, getting car sick. That's a big indicator the vestibular system is not working correctly. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to speed it up just a little bit. Auditory challenges: if they seem to miss directions, they mishear tone of voice, they're sensitive to loud noises, that's a big one. That would be an indicator that we're in that dorsal vagal state, that our survival reflexes are active, fight or flight or fear paralysis. They hear background noises like the clock and papers rustling, but they don't remember things that you said to them. And then, of course, poor phonological processing and phonemic awareness. Visual issues: do they skip letters, words, or lines of text? Do they hold their paper at an unusual angle? Like I had a kid I worked with that used to always hold their paper up here. They could not put it down flat on the desk. Do they avoid reading tasks? Do they have watery eyes, or do they rub their eyes? Do they reverse their letters? Do they make errors copying? And is their handwriting crooked, slanted, or poorly spaced? Those are all indicators that we have an issue in the sensory system or with our reflexes. Now, what do you do about it? So as a classroom teacher, it's a hands-off situation, right? So I have a license to touch, so it's a little bit different. So what can you do in the classroom? These are things that I did for 20 years in the classroom. So you can show kids how to do this, called the Moro squeeze or embracing squeeze. You literally just take the arm, you give a nice deep squeeze, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, slow release. You can do this for yourself right now. just to feel how amazing that is. It's like getting a lovely hug, and it activates all of our proprioceptors, which gives our brain a sense of safety. So if kids are anxious, nervous, crying, overwhelmed, this is a great one for them. A weighted blanket activates proprioceptors, and feet stomping. You ever seen a toddler throw a fit and they stomp their feet a lot? Well, that actually resets the brainstem. So that's why they do it. And you can use it too. You can have kids, we're all going to stomp our feet together really hard, and it will reset their nervous system. That's a fun little trick. Proprioception. Remember, neurotactile is a subset of proprioception. So you can use that embracing squeeze or the weighted blanket or the stomping. But you can also use these wobble seats, use them a lot at Park Academy. Anything that's weight bearing, like crawling or push-ups, heavy lifting, anything that activates those muscles and ligaments will activate our proprioceptors and again, promote a sense of safety in the brain. For vestibular or balance, any kind of balance activities, balance foam, beams, balance boards, trampoline, swinging, rocking, spinning. I like to have kids on balance boards while they're doing reading activity or playing catch with me on balance boards. So we're getting more than one sense involved at the same time. For auditory, one therapy that I use here a lot is the Safe and Sound protocol. School personnel can use it with kids. That's Stephen Porges's work, polyvagal theory, and it relaxes the middle ear. And it allows us to process all of the frequencies as we are supposed to. In a stress state, our middle ear actually clamps down. Lots more information on this, and I included the link to that in the resources slide. Soundstory is another listening therapy program which uses bone conduction to activate our auditory system. A four-brain device uses bone conduction and amplification so that we can hear the sounds of the language more clearly. Combining phonemic awareness activities with balance is very effective. Lazy H, which are infinity signs, and then cross crawls. And if you aren't familiar with cross crawls, go to YouTube. They're all over the internet. That comes from Brain Gym. They've been around about 40 years, but kids are crossing the midline, which helps with auditory and visual processing. Now visual, cross crawls, lazy eights, cat cow, which I have pictured here, that helps integrate that STNR, and then any kind of visual tracking exercises. And then finally, multi-sensory instruction. Now, if you teach reading, you've heard all about this. Orton Gillingham is one of the multi-sensory approaches. But normally multi-sensory instruction is not done correctly. It's like, first I do this, like I will listen and then I'll write and then I'll touch something. But true multi-sensory instruction, remember how our senses operate on the same pathway in the early years, means that we use as many senses simultaneously, not one after another. So here's some examples. I have students stand on balance boards while they do phonemic awareness activities. So now we have vestibular and auditory. I have students use foam letters to trace them, tactile, while they say the letter, visual, and the sound, auditory. Stomp their feet really hard while they're spelling out loud. I've done scooter board phonics. I've done floor piano phonics. We've done having kids bounce a ball between each other while on a balance board, while spelling out a word. So as many senses as you can engage at the same time allows their brains to process that sensory information if it is an immature system. And then through the use will actually help them separate so that they can use them independently. Okay, so that is the end of the information. And here's my references. And then here's some more information for things that you might find useful. And this is how you can contact me. I do have a website for my practice, a Facebook and LinkedIn and YouTube channel, and I do a bi-weekly newsletter. I put out some pretty cool articles there that you can sign up for on my website, and that is how you would contact me. So I think we have a few minutes left to take some questions. Is that correct?